Hello there, Glocal citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I'm Florence Adu, your host, and I'm enjoying the springish summer that is now taking place in New York. And I am gearing up for next week when I will be in the region where my guest is going to or is coming from. And so I'll just get right into it. So my next guest makes visible the unremembered. Borrowing from elements of architecture, history, and archaeology, she creates narratives that challenge colonial hierarchies and invisibility. Working in a variety of disciplines, her practice includes painting, installation, photography, writing, video, and public interventions. Her work with colonial era pottery led to a commission with the renowned brand of porcelain products, the Royal Copenhagen. She has exhibited her work in the Caribbean, US, and Europe in institutions such as the Museo del Barrio in New York, Casa de las Americas in Cuba, the Museum of the African Diaspora in California, and Christiansborg Palace in Denmark. Her art is in the collections of the National Photography Museum and the Vestsjælland Museum in Denmark. She is the co-creator of I Am Queen Mary, the artist-led groundbreaking monument that confronts the Danish colonial amnesia while commemorating the legacies of resistance of the African people who were brought to the former Danish West Indies. The project was featured in over 100 media outlets around the world. As a 2018-2020 fellow at the Social Justice Institute at the Barnard Research Center for Women at Columbia University, she worked on a project about the citizenless Virgin Islanders in the Harlem Renaissance. Her studio is based in the Virgin Islands. Vaughn Belle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's so crazy to have this conversation after not seeing you for what? I don't know, 15 odd years, is it?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So just background, folks. It's so funny that we're now in our second adulthood, I guess, if you want to call it that, because Vaughn and I know each other from our post-university years when we were both Teach for America core members. So we met in Houston, Texas. We spent a hot summer about now, it was very, very hot in Houston, teaching little ones, figuring out how we were going to, impact minds and do something for the world. And I went on to be in Washington, D.C., and you were in New York, right?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. So that's how in the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we spent our 2 years doing that and then moved on to other lives. And so I'm just so happy to have you here and to see you. And
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So let's jump right in. Tell us more. Tell us where you're from, where you are local, and what is your craft?
Well, I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, on the island of Tobago, but I moved to the Virgin Islands when I was an infant, just at about 5 months old. Mm-hmm. So, I would say the Virgin Islands I claim that as my home. I don't really know much. I don't have another home in that sense. I've lived in both St. Thomas. My first 6 years, I lived in St. Thomas, and then I moved to St. Croix when I was 7. So I really feel myself more to be a Crucian than anything else, because it's where my most formative years have been. In terms of my craft, I'm a visual artist. As you mentioned in my bio, my practice isn't centered in a medium. So it really first begins with thinking about my art practice as a way to develop knowledge, a way to create dialogue. And so I think first about what ideas I want to work with and then what forms should be best. So that's why I work in so many different disciplines.
So as we discussed, we both were teachers. So tell us more about what inspired you to be a teacher at first, and then how you then determined that you were going to go back home. Like, how did that transition happen for you?
Yeah. Well, that experience doing Teach for both my parents were teachers in various forms. My mother was an elementary school teacher. And then my father was a priest. And, he also taught religion in my high school. And so he was a teacher as well. And because of that experience, I never wanted to be a teacher. I kind of saw how stressful it could be and how it was kind of a profession that really was like a labor of love and a passion, and that I just felt I wanted to do something else with my life. But my last year of Columbia, my job was at the Career Resource Center. So I was the one that when recruiters came to the campus, I would help them set up the room for their presentations and help them give out the materials and things like that. That was my work study job.
Mhm.
And there was a woman, I still remember her name, Kaya Anderson. She
Oh,
recruited
Kaya. Yeah.
out of me. She would not let me leave without committing to applying for Teach for America. And I
Yeah.
was like, I don't want to be a teacher. She's like, apply. And it worked out because, my senior year, like so many people who do liberal arts degrees, I really didn't know what I was going
Mhm.
to do when I was
Mhm.
graduating.
Mhm.
I knew I wanted to be an artist, but I didn't. I made that decision quite late in my
Mm.
university career, and also Columbia didn't really have like a fine arts program like that per se. So,
Mhm.
I just thought, well, what am I gonna do? And I ended up applying to that program like I promised Kaya I would, and I
Mhm.
got in, and so that's what I did. So I did that I did that for 3 years doing Teach for America, the 2 year commitment. Then I stayed teaching another year, and I tried to figure out how to be an artist. And it's so funny because most people go to New York to be an artist. I left New York.
Mhm. 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 Right, exactly. I remember. It's like, Levon left and she's an
Yeah,
artist. I'm like, really?
I know.
Wow.
I left New York to be an artist because I really needed to go back home to kind of reconnect to my roots, my history, my culture. I didn't want to be an exile artist.
Mm.
I needed that space. And New York, that lifestyle is so hectic. I
Mhm.
wouldn't have been able to, I would have had to have like 4 jobs to be able to
Yeah.
sustain
Yeah.
myself
Afford.
and try to have
Yeah.
a practice, a studio space. It just was very complicated. So I decided
Yeah.
to go back home. I ended up doing like a part-time tutoring service. I just kind of
Okay.
started a part-time tutoring business. So I do that in the mornings, and then the rest of the day I would work on my practice.
Mhm.
And then I decided after that that I really I was like, well, if I'm gonna make this is my career, I think I maybe would want to have a little more education. I
Mhm.
definitely
Mhm.
felt a little bit kind of an outsider of my own field.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's when I decided to go back to school, and but I wanted to stay in the region because art schools in the United States are ridiculously expensive. So that wasn't really an option. So that is how I ended up in Cuba. I found an art school there that just fascinated me because it had all of the artistic disciplines on one campus, which is very unusual. Most schools, it's like a music conservatory, it's separate, or a film school, it's separate. It
Mm.
had
Mhm.
everything all on the same campus. And I decided to go there first for a summer to check it out. And I just fell in love with Havana. And so I changed my whole life and I moved. I didn't even know if I could get into a program. I was there for a summer and came back 4 months later, had someone else I didn't really sell, but I had someone else do the tutoring that I was doing, gave them all my clients, and I packed up and I moved to Cuba indefinitely.
Wow.
Lived there for
Wow.
4 years.
Yeah. So how did you find, because that was quote unquote communist Cuba, right? But you being from the Caribbean, and I'm sure you having a Caribbean passport, it was not as challenging for you
Well,
to.
because the United States, I live in the Virgin Islands, which is a U.S. territory. So
Okay.
I had originally, I was born as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, but then I
Hmm.
became naturalized as a U.S. citizen when I was about
Okay.
17 or so. And then,
Hmm.
but I did end up getting another passport back to be able to, not that I couldn't study in Cuba, but because the embargo and the travel restrictions were so challenging, it made it easier
Right.
to use another passport in the back and
Okay.
forth. But that did not make it any less stressful. It was always having to go through third party countries, always having to kind of
Mm.
deal with immigration. There was once I would always be switching my passports back and forth, and one time I got in trouble over doing that, and ended up
Hmm.
just because they got confused, like I didn't have one stamp that they were looking for because it was
Right.
a passport, and I didn't,
Yeah.
it just became. So it was very stressful actually,
I
being
can imagine.
and because it was stressful because also the country that I had used my passport for didn't have a embassy in Cuba, and so I was kind of unprotected in a way because I couldn't go to the
Mm.
U.S. embassy if anything happened.
Hmm.
I have lots of crazy stories about my time living in Cuba. I even got deported when I was there.
Oh my
My
gosh.
first 6 months, I
Was
ended
was
up.
this at the end, or you had to
No,
be
in the very
deported
beginning, because I couldn't figure out. Because remember how I went? I went on a tourist visa, having to
Yeah.
switch it into a student visa because you can't
Yeah.
study as a tourist. So
Right.
I had to figure out how to do that. And by the time I did, my tourist visa had already expired. So
Okay.
they basically, yeah, I was escorted onto the plane.
But a
But I
testament
could come
to
back.
the
They were like, you can come back today if you want, but you just got to go and get a new stamp on your passports, which is what
oh, well, that's nice.
I
Well,
did.
that's
It
good.
wasn't menacing, but I was escorted onto the plane.
Okay. They're like, you gotta go. You can come back. That's good though.
I did.
At
I
least you know.
did. I went to Cancun for the day. It was like a day trip that they had pitched to ambassadors. Like to go like
Okay.
a shopping trip. So I
Yeah.
left in the morning and I came back that same afternoon, and I was
And
able
it was
to then get the process to get my student visa.
wow. Wow. That sounds lovely though. But I hear such great things about Havana and about the Cuban people. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It was, one of the great adventures of my life. I'm really
Okay.
I did that.
Okay. So you went to art school and then you finished and then you decided, okay, I'm gonna go back home.
I did. My father, unfortunately, he passed away right before I was finishing up my master's thesis.
Oh
So
wow.
I had to kind of drop everything, go to his funeral. And then I finished my thesis and I came back to just kind of be with my mother for a while.
Yeah.
Um, and I was bringing out also my boyfriend in Cuba. I mean,
Mhm.
we got married. We're now since divorced, but that was another huge chapter of my life. And so we
Mhm.
stayed and made a life and had three beautiful children and
Mhm.
did that. And I just kind of tried to find a way to be an artist,
Yeah.
and I did have four jobs anyway.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other question is okay.
In the
So
beginning, I
you
did because I mean, I couldn't work in Cuba. I was just a student, and
right.
even if I tried to get a job, the average salary in Cuba is like $10. So it didn't
Yeah.
make sense for me to try
Yeah.
to get a job there anyway. I mean, when I say $10, I mean a month. So
Right. Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
it didn't make any sense for me to work when I was there. So by the time I came out, I really had to find a way. One of the things that I did, luckily, when I was doing Teach for America, I saved a lot of my money that I made in New York. I
Mm-hmm.
came from a background, both my parents, a priest and a teacher, they were very frugal, Caribbean people, very frugal. So I picked that up and I had saved some money. So when I came back home, one of the things I was very committed. I mean, I spent all this time to learn how to be an artist. I was not going to give it up which a lot of people do, just kind of they find other career paths to make a living and they don't ever really commit.
Yeah.
And so I was not going to do that. So I decided that I was going to stabilize my practice by purchasing studio space. I
Okay.
figured that because otherwise then I'd have to be renting a studio, and then
Mm-hmm.
that changes the kind of work you're making, and it just beholdens you to other interests,
Mm-hmm.
especially here in the Caribbean. Like, artwork can get very tourist oriented, and I just,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to stabilize my practice, I ended up finding some damaged derelict buildings downtown Christiansborg,
Mm-hmm.
and I got them for super cheap. I bought that building for $25,000. It was selling for 40, but I was able to negotiate it down to 25, which is unheard of. I got it for a really good deal.
Right.
But that started my real estate journey.
Ah.
I mean, I had
Okay.
bought a property before that because my father was just so like, girl, how you gonna be this no job with no pension? I mean, what are you doing?
Right.
He really encouraged me to do something. So I bought a property right when I came back from New York, just a little duplex, just as a retirement investment. It didn't make any money. It was just kind of like, I'll pay it off. The rent will pay itself, and then at least I'll have some income when I retire.
Yeah.
I'll never retire. I'm an artist, but just something. He just really encouraged me to do something. Like, he's like,
Mm-hmm.
take care of that part of your life, because
Mm-hmm.
what happens if you can't work, and you don't want to have to depend on children, and you just need to
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
about that in your life. So I did. So that was my first, and then I had these little buildings that I renovated to do my studio. And then one day, when I was doing a documentary project around my renovation, and one day the camera guy, he ran into a guy that he played poker with, and I recognized the guy's name as the owner of a lot of buildings downtown, and he was selling one of them. And so I said, "Hey, aren't you the guy that's selling that one particular building downtown?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was like, my husband and I, we've been looking for a place to do our salsa classes, because we taught the salsa classes together. But we were tired of kind of doing it in other people's spaces. Or he really was. I was happy doing that. He was like, no, we need our own thing. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. But anyway, we made a deal with him from me walking from my studio to walking to his building. We made a deal in that 5-minute walk where he pretty much offered, he's like, if you guys really want it, I will lease to own. I will do a lease to own with you guys. I'll lease it to you. He gave me a price. He said this, and I'll sell it to you for this, and da-da-da. And it was just like that.
Wow.
Just like moment could change your life. Just like that.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, okay. So we hustled, and we signed a deal with him. We were totally naive. We thought that building was a whorehouse. It had a downstairs, had a stripper pole in that place. I mean, I don't know what we thought, but we did this crazy thing together. We worked our asses off for 1 year, like dogs. We worked 12-hour days renovating, and ran out of money, and were able to just get 2 of the 4 apartments done. And that kind of became, I started doing Airbnb. I was like one of the first people here to do Airbnb. I got in on that game early. So I was doing Airbnb. That's how I was able to kind of like keep it going. And then when we had to pay him the money, because it was a 3-year lease to own, our major oil refinery closed down, which is like the highest private employer on island. We lost 3,000 of the highest paying jobs, and our economy, it was like a natural disaster without.
Wow.
Wow. And that is the condition that I was trying to get a bank loan, and I couldn't get one.
Wow.
So that was pretty scary, because we invested all this money, we did all this work, and then we couldn't get the money to pay him off to finish the deal. And I had to do some finagling. It was weird how I look back on my life and think, how did that all happen? But because my mom was sick and I was in charge of her estate, and the house that we were living in was slated to be mine in her trust, I basically was able to leverage that.
Yep.
So that's it. And then the guy looked at me and was so impressed with what we did. Even as he saw how we struggled, I never paid that man late. I kept my word. We needed like an extension. I think we asked for like a 6-month extension as we were having a difficulty with the financing. But he just was so impressed with us. He turned around and said, I have some more buildings that I'm trying to sell. And I want you to have this one, and I'll sell it to you at whatever rate you want, whatever terms you want, and whatever you can put down. And that was when I learned really the power of networking. And really how to develop business relationships with people where that's how they lend money to people that they trust and want to support. And that was a lesson. So that's how I ended up getting the building that I'm in right now, which was, I was not financially prepared to do it. I was not exhausted, but he gave a deal that I couldn't really refuse. It was kind of like I wouldn't say once in a lifetime, but it's very rare for someone to say, I'm going to be your bank and you can put down whatever you want. And and very, very rare. That doesn't really happen.
It's like a quasi benefactor situation.
In a way, yeah. He was like a mentor and really, decided that he, wanted, of course he made a lot of money. If you understand mortgages, he made good money. His mortgage, any mortgage, you're making like 3 times the sales price. And here he was.
Exactly.
With a willing buyer that he knew would pay him on time. And you know what I mean? So it was also a good business move for him. And I wish more people understood that you can do your own mortgages with people and you get back and you make the 3 times the money.
Exactly.
And that's why our community will flourish more. So I've learned a lot with that journey, but it started there. And so in addition to my art, I manage about 15 apartments.
Oh, wow. Okay.
2 commercial. So I have a restaurant tenant, and along the way, someone approached me, a historian, after an exhibition during the opening, I had mentioned I had just bought these 2 little buildings in downtown, and he said to me, oh, I'm going to do some research for you on those buildings. And I was like, okay, I had no idea why he told me that. And then he met with me a couple weeks later and kind of on a sheet of paper kind of outlay the genealogy of the building. and it
Wow.
blew me away. So the building was from the 1700s. The
Wow.
first registered owner was from 1777. She was African born. She survived the Middle Passage.
Wow.
She bought herself out of slavery and then was able to buy a house in 1700s, which is
Wow.
so unusual. And that what was even more interesting was she wasn't the only one. The first three owners were all African born women that had very similar stories. And
Uh-huh.
it just made me look at my buildings so different because they're really small. They're like laborers, like row house kind of buildings.
Yeah.
And I just thought, well, how come, and then he told me, yeah, this is your building is a part of the town that's called Free Gut. It's where all the first freed enslaved people
Mm.
settle out. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't live on the sugar plantations. This is where they lived.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was a very unknown part of our history. And
Mm-hmm.
because, I didn't have a lot of money, so I did the work really piece. It took me, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm still working on it. It's 10 years later in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I would put a little 5,000 here, 6,000 here into the building. I did it very piece, and I did a lot of the work myself. And in doing
Sure.
that, I learned so much about the materiality of the
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
And that is what it transformed my life, and it also transformed my artwork because I really started to make these connections between materials and narratives, objects, place,
Mm-hmm.
and narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
pretty much, I bought that building in 2011, and all of my work after that you could very much see how it was connected to that experience of renovating that house.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'll give you an example. So, for an example, like, first, it made me think a lot about when I had to redo my roof. The rafters have these hand planed beadwork, like someone would take a tool and literally rub it back and forth to create grooves in each rafter. And so when you're renovating a building like that, you try to keep those details. But sometimes you don't have the money because it costs money to pay someone
Right.
for those very those kinds of details. And when I thought about that, it just made me realize like how their houses, as modest as they were, as small as they are, which are just about 500 square feet, that how precious they were. And when you consider the fact that in the 17 and early 1800s, before slavery was abolished, what free meant was so tenuous. So, for
Yeah.
example, if you're living in the late 1700s, you may be free, but if you're a man or woman, you have to carry your free papers. You cannot leave your house after 10. You cannot gather in groups in public. You cannot have certain business licenses. You can't marry whites. The women were told they couldn't wear lace or tulle or chintz, anything, so the men had to hunt runaway slaves as a condition of their freedom. So they
Wow.
had a lot of restrictions placed on them. So when you think about that, what freedom means, it means that their domestic spaces are really these only places that are free. So I've done sculptures and other projects out that kind of come from the design of the house, the materiality of the house, some of the coral stones that were used in the foundations, different things. My artwork came kind of out of really thinking through very deeply those connections in the history.
Wow, how that is fascinating. And it's so true. I started reading slave narratives, both from the Caribbean and Africa and the US perspective in the last couple of years. And it just is so deep, like the emotional part of it. And even the idea of the survival, the things that were necessary to be done for survival and for the preservation of the family unit. And this aspect of the free versus slave straddle of I've never heard anything like that, but it makes perfect sense, just that.
I learned doing that project that was so that there's so many things like we think we know about slavery, but we don't
Yeah,
really know. So, for
no.
example, there were people that owned my house that were enslaved that owned slaves, and
Mm,
that seems
mm-hmm,
like morally like how could they do that? But it's
mm-hmm,
really you have to kind of understand that. But people were the money. People were the
mm-hmm,
capital. So there
mm-hmm,
were many reasons why people would choose to own other people, even if they were
mm-hmm.
formerly enslaved themselves.
Right.
Sometimes they did it. They would buy a family member, but then they would hold on to them. I mean, not in the way, but they would own them so that maybe because you could get a mortgage based on a person.
Mm-hmm.
do things. So there were other, maybe you bought them so you could protect them in a way. You bought them so
Yeah.
someone else wouldn't buy them. You know, there were
Right.
so many, there were so many situations to really kind of think through when I really looked at the people who owned my house, the relationships that they had, how they were able to get their freedom. Like there was a woman who owned my house as well, who didn't really own it. She was what was called a housekeeper, because legally black women couldn't marry the white European men or American men that also actually were here too. So they would call them legally housekeepers. And that would mean that, yeah, they probably cleaned their house, but they also were kind of like a quote unquote concubine or some kind of mistress situation. And sometimes they were adult women, but sometimes they were children. So one of the women, she went to work for a family when she was 8 years old to be a companion to one of the daughters. And by the time she was about 15 or 16, she has a child for the father, right?
Wow.
And in that relationship, he granted her the rights to the house that I'm living in. He didn't outright give her
Okay.
lifetime rights to live in it. So all of those things you start to kind of, and then she chose not to live in the house, but to put her mother to live in the house. And then she chose to actually live in the family of the daughter that she was the companion for. I mean, so it's just when you just see these like relationships that are happening through the documents in the archives, it just makes you wonder about the nuances and people's agency or lack of agency as well.
Right. Right.
And then, of course, you know, it makes you just think even about now the kinds of ways that women also use sexuality or power or beauty or whatever vehicles that we have to maneuver in a society that is still quite patriarchal and racist.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So you decided your studio was going to be located in this certain area. Say the name of the area again.
It's called Free Gut in Christiansborg. Yeah,
Free Gut. Okay.
And it's called that. I mean, it was actually called a not so nice term. It was called like the N-word gut in Danish, but it's been since known as now Free Gut. And gut is basically like a dried riverbed. Our town kind of is like on a hillside coming down into a flat.
Okay.
So they would put the guts were not. So basically, it's like all the guts are kind of where people, which are those. It's normally dry, but it's where when it rains, the water flows into the ocean. Those are where the housing settlements would be, along the guts.
Sure. Right. The least valuable land, I guess, so to speak. Yeah. So where then do you actually live? Give us a little bit of a sense of.
Yeah, so I live in St. Croix is divided into east and west. That's how we kind of talk about it, east and west. And so I live on the eastern part, which is where the town of Christiansborg. We have two towns. They're both named after Danish kings. In Denmark, they name their kings 1 year Christian, 1 year Frederick. And so it's like Christian V, then Frederick II, and it goes like that. And so our towns were named after, all of our towns actually, the ones in St. Thomas also were named after Danish royalty. So I live in Christiansborg, and I live just outside the downtown historic area in a suburb.
Okay.
But I spend most of my time in the downtown area because that's where my kids go to school. That's where my studio is. And it's a walking, gridded town, which is also quite unusual in the Caribbean. A lot of the towns kind of like had like a very organic kind of growth system. But our towns were pre-planned. So they're gridded towns like in New York, like a gridded city. It's like that.
Interesting. I have to make it down there.
It's beautiful.
I hear it's really
you could probably do a period piece from the 1800s in our town. Like it's very, very historic.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah. Got to make it down there. So speaking of, tell us some of your Glocal speak. Like, what do you hear a word or a phrase or saying?
Well, yeah,
that's part of your
speak. Well, every island has their own vernacular that they will call it. In St. Thomas, they call it Tomian, and in St. John, it would be Jonian. And then here in St. Croix, we call it Crujan. And when you ask about the phrase, I wouldn't say so much like what you will hear on the street, but I will say, because it connects to this major art project I'm doing, we learn a folk song from the time we're little, like probably kindergarten, you learn that song. You always hear it. You learn it. It's done at cultural events. And it is about a major labor revolt that happened in 1878. in which it's 30 years after the abolition of slavery, but the conditions hadn't really changed. So people rebelled again. And it was a major rebellion that lasted for several days where they burnt down, almost 50 plantations and like a major part of the town of Frederiksted, which is the other town on the other side of the island. And women emerge as the most popular leaders in the folklore. I mean, there were, of course, men who participated. But what's very interesting is that we have this folklore around the queens of the Fayaban, which is called the Fayaban. And as a child, the most popular one is named Queen Mary, who I have this major monument project named in her honor called I Am Queen Mary that I did with the Danish artist Jeanette Ehlers. And when we're children, we learn a song that is basically says, I cannot really sing it like that, but it goes, we're asking the question, Queen Mary, where we gonna go born? Which means where are we going to born? It's like we're talking. So what I find so interesting about that song is that from a little child, that first you're talking to spirit. You're talking to an ancestor. So we learn that we can communicate to an ancestor because we are singing about this ancestor and we're asking her, where are the systems that need to get destroyed? That's basically what it's saying. The song is, where we gonna go on? What are the other systems? And so that is so infused in what it is to be a Virgin Islander. Because imagine from a little girl, that there's something called a firebond. There's a person called Queen Mary she was the leader, and you try to tell her, okay, where are we gonna go bond Queen Mary? What else? What do we need to do? And we're all learned that there's this woman spirit ancestor that we're asking that question to. That has so infiltrated our psyche of who we are as Virgin Islanders, especially as Crucians. I mean, we call on that spirit for everything. Like anything is difficult in your life, you feel like we're the place where we bond down things, like that's how we see it. Like we're that girl, or like we're that place, we're that place that we know that if things are really against the wall, we know what to do because we've been asking that question on what to do since we've been children.
Wow.
So do you feel very unique to being a Virgin Islander?
So do you feel like there is definitely a revolutionary spirit there, like a real strong?
Very. Even though we're colonized, we've been colonized 7 times. And on the other hand of that same question, I would say that, we have a colonial relationship to the United States. A lot of people don't recognize the United States as an empire because they so much speak for democracy. But, the United States has about 5 different colonial entities around the world. Puerto Rico is probably the one that people know of the most popular is Puerto Rico. We are in the similar relationship with the United States as Puerto Rico in this kind of limbo space where we do have American citizenship, but we don't have full citizenship. And we don't really have full, total governance over our economy because, Puerto Rico right now has this horrible situation where they're beholden to these shareholders because of their debt. But it's almost like the United States doesn't, although we are so very much dependent on the federal dollars, it's like a relationship where they don't ever give us enough to properly manage ourselves or to even figure out how we can, but at the same time, they don't allow us to become independent either. So you're in this horrible in-between space where you're constantly dependent on them to manage basic things, schooling, education, health, to get the funds to have your government function, but it's never enough. So just that, and then also, like even in the pandemic, because they have all these control boards monitoring how we spend the money, here we are trying to get all the PPE for the schools and all these things, but we can't because they give us approval so late, so we can't do the purchase orders to buy the things we need. And so it's so much dysfunction when you live in a colonial society like that. People can't even begin to understand how it impacts every aspect of our lives.
Right. And there's very little awareness of that, actually. Like Puerto Rico was an example. So with the hurricane more recently under the Trump administration, it was very clear that there was a clear problem. What we don't hear so much about is the Virgin Islands. We don't hear the stories.
Or Samoa or
Exactly. But we do know that poverty is still a problem, because so our tax is high. Were you in St. Croix or?
They're not any high because we have the same U.S. tax system.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
that I think, I really will emphasize that it's because of it's like that classic book. I can't remember if it's France or how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I think
Yes.
it's either
Yes.
Rami or Fernando wrote that book. It's a classic situation of underdevelopment that is directly tied to your American status,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not
Mm-hmm.
being able to fully determine yourself, but then having to be dependent on an entity that isn't giving you the resources you need to even properly manage what you do have.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that's kind of it in a nutshell. Why there is so much poverty here. So what
Yeah.
we do have is like in Puerto Rico, where there are hundreds. Literally, there was one year where almost 100,000 people left Puerto Rico. We also have mass exodus of Virgin Islanders who
Mm-hmm.
migrate to the United States to
Mm-hmm.
first get full access to U.S. citizenship and all the rights and all the benefits, and then also just because it is very difficult to live here. So what you often have is you know, St. John is probably the clearest example of what could happen. You might call them our yellow canary, our canary, where when you think about a canary in a mine, that they're the ones that kind of signal when something is wrong, that not
Mm-hmm.
everyone can see, but they
Mm-hmm.
can. That's why they're in the mines. St. Thomas is our canary in that sense, because what's happened
Mm-hmm.
in St. John is that it's the smallest of the three islands. Part of it was a national park from when Rockefeller owned it, American
Yep.
businessman, everybody knows,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
donated part of it to the national park system of the US. And so, what that created for the other part of the island is that it's now become like a luxury
Yes.
resort place for millionaires, mostly
Yep.
American millionaires. So, what does that mean for the local Black population that's been there for generations? That means that their home that they were paying their property taxes on are now to the rate of people who just put up a $10 million mansion. And so it's created a lot of disenfranchisement of land and people not being able to afford their property taxes. But even more than that, people just also feeling alienated in their own space. Because when you
Yeah.
have a place that's now outwardly focused, and your show is so much about global and
Mm-hmm.
local, when you have a space where so many people have now relocated there and then transform your restaurants, your everything now becomes centered through their lens.
Yeah.
People who've been there for generations walk around and they're just like, where? What am I living in? What? Who is this? Who is this place for?
Right.
So that the fear is that that cannot be contained to St. John. That will happen on all of the islands
Right.
because
Right.
we're U.S. territory.
Yeah. Just you
We're
get
nicer than Florida
occupied.
in a way,
Yeah.
So it's
Basically.
just
Yeah.
if you want that quote unquote paradise Caribbean lifestyle, it's very easy to get on a plane and come here
Mm-hmm.
and create that for yourself. And we have a lot of that. And what you'll find is like people who grow up here, they leave and go to the States, and then they're wealthy Americans that come here and relocate and totally transform the culture.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think of your leadership there? Is it, basically they're puppets in some regard, or do you feel like you have strong enough leadership that maybe will able to make the change?
I think it's more than just the leadership. It is
Hmm.
really a reckoning. It has to be a whole. I think the problem is that our version of colonialism isn't so uncomfortable that it
Mm.
requires a firebomb that like what happened in
Hmm.
1870. It's
Hmm.
still quite. It's although there's lots of things that are uncomfortable, you can actually just move to the States if it's really that uncomfortable. So I think that
Right.
that's part of the issue. It isn't, it's more like a structural issue than a leadership issue.
Mm. Hmm.
Although
Hmm.
if we had leadership that was much more minded on our own self-determination and focusing
Yeah.
on our status and seeing that that really is something that needs to be dealt with, it would change. But it is also totally indoctrinated into our educational system. I mean,
That was my question. Yes.
our
Hmm.
curriculum, we learn more about the US than we learn about our own history.
Of
Because
course.
if we
Hmm.
get federal US dollars, where are the curriculums coming from? The
Yep.
United States. If it's based on testing that's coming from the US, what are the
Yeah.
teachers teaching?
Yeah.
What the curriculum standards are for the United States. So ingrained in that is also of the process of colonialism. Like
Yes.
we are very trained to kind of think much more about the US and their history than we
Exactly.
even about ourselves and what we really
Mhm.
need and how to think forward. And so that's part of the challenge. But even with that, I love living here. Even with all those
Mhm.
challenges, I love living
Mhm.
here because of the sense of community, uh,
Mhm.
the rich history. Of course, it's a
Mhm.
very beautiful place to live, slower pace lifestyle. Because also being a part of the US, it's kind of like Brooklyn in the Caribbean, meaning that it's
Okay.
every Caribbean place, everywhere. We have people from St. Lucia, Trinidad, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic. There's not, I don't think, a place in the Caribbean that they don't have people here or communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
it's because of the same access to the US dollar. And it's the only English speaking US territory in the Caribbean.
okay.
So people from all over the Caribbean that move here.
Make it very easy. Yeah. I feel a lot of similarities to how it is in Ghana. With you mentioning the way the education system is, children don't learn about Ghanaian history. They learn about,
Oh, wow.
English history, the Cambridge system. I looked at one of my niece's books and I was like, it was like 2 pages of Ghanaian history. And it's just like,
Oh, I didn't
really?
even
So you're really expecting these children to grow up and be in service of the crown that is no longer, or to, like you said, the American empire. So yeah, I think where it all starts is education, which is part of the reason why I'm still in that space.
And that's part into that project that I did with Jeanette.
Yes.
When I talked about that, my practice is also a way to create dialogue and a way to create
Yes.
knowledge. Creating that monument was about that. It was about creating a space to begin to have different kinds of conversations about our shared colonial history.
Mhm.
And I think the public art, that was my first major public art project. It was inaugurated in 2018.
That's going to do it for part 1 of my conversation with Vaughn Belle. Please be sure to join us next week when we talk more about the I Am Queen Mary project and more about Vaughn's life in the Virgin Islands. As always, you can catch us with new episodes each and every Tuesday at www.glocalcitizenspod.com and wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, where you can find out a little bit more about the guests that are on every week. And please do like us, give us a review. It really helps people find the podcast. So that would be wonderful if you can do that. Suggest a guest. We're here for it. So until next time, bye for now.